Good evening. This is November 18th, meeting of the Community Comprehensive Planning Committee. I think everyone that is coming may be here. So we'll start with our usual exciting and insightful icebreaker.
It makes me laugh every time I get introduced to do this. Okay, this one's a little bit more involved. So imagine that it's 10 years from now and a newspaper article comes out about the comprehensive plan. What does the headline say about 10 years from now about the success, hopefully, of the comprehensive plan? What's the headline of the news article?
10 years from now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Adam, yeah, sure. Why don't you start?
I'm Adam Lee. Auburn exceeds expectations.
I think mine would be that they didn't think we could do it.
Nailed it.
Comprehensive plan goals achieved. New comprehensive plan committee starting.
We're happy we're still in business, and we're happy the City of Auburn has done a comp plan.
Achieved more than we thought.
Cleveland is dead. The plan lives on.
How do I follow that?
Don't try.
The state looks up to Auburn as it paves forward.
I'm not creative at all with this. Lots of new housing, meeting people's needs. Now what?
Looking back, what went well, what went poorly.
Resilient, connected, welcoming, intentional. It's time to redo Auburn's comprehensive plan.
Expansion in South Auburn reaches capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Auburn, Maine, rated one of America's top 10 cities, small cities to live in.
Nothing original. Comp plan a success.
Yeah, I'm not very creative either, but Auburn continues to thrive.
Auburn continues to lead the way.
Staff requests money for a new update.
Everyone is happy.
Say, visitors choose Auburn over any other city in Maine to visit.
Comp plan implemented well.
Very good. So let's, for the public and for the record, we'll go through the roll call. Kelly, we'll start at your end for that. And we'll go around this way.
Kelly Butler.
Becky Conrad.
Bruce Ryu.
Matthew Duval.
Riley Bergeron. Paul Jacques.
Dana Staples.
John Cleveland.
Tim Cowan.
Rick Whiting.
Jeff Harmon.
Dennis Bergeron.
Rex Rhodes.
Adam Lee.
Allie Toby Barry Dunn. Ashley Aaron Barry Dunn.
Lauren Cafe.
David Hedeker.
Dennis Dote.
Phil Kroll.
Okay. Oh, and Virginia Keel did call. She apologizes she couldn't be here. She has a conflict with another group or committee that she works with. And when we changed our meeting dates, it created a conflict. But she'll be back for the next one. Next item is the minutes of October the 28th, 2025. I don't know if you had, hopefully you had a chance to read them over. I have one typo, most important one though. Under public comment, a gentleman named Stephen Beal made public comments. He spells his last name with an E. Quite important to him.
I'll second that.
All right, if there are no other comments, is there a motion to accept the minutes as amended?
So moved.
Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? Unanimous. This is the time in the agenda where we offer the opportunity for public comment. I'll ask if the one person who's here has a public comment.
I am the aforementioned Stephen Beal with an E, of 575 Johnson Road and 93A Shepley Street. This is the phase of your work where you're developing the land use, future planning and map and areas and different zones for different types of activities. And one thing that I haven't seen any attention paid to yet, or at least not in sufficient degree, is the nature of the geography and the geology and the soils in the city. This city is kind of on one of the lines that work their way back from the coast, working northwest from coastal plain to true mountains. And the differences between the soil types and the geography in the South Auburn, Danville area and the area surrounding Lake Auburn and along Perkins Ridge Road is really substantial. So I would urge that you do a bit of a dive into the geography and the soil types and the geological arrangements in various parts of the city when formulating different uses, because that's just as important as the low density, medium density, high density characteristics of where you desire to have activities conducted of different types. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beal. We'll take that in consideration as we continue our work. Item 5 is a vision statement. Barry Dunn has made some changes based on our recommendations last meeting, and so I'll turn it over to Ally to walk us through the changes.
So changes were made in line with suggestions from last meeting, so adding arts and culture and schools to the community goal, and then we made some small language cleanups as well, just to make sure that this reads well and reads correctly. And then based on Jane's feedback for posting to the public site, also added a little bit more detail and information about the purpose and the intent of the vision, and that there's more detail to come for the later parts of the plan.
Okay. And you all provided a typical underline and strikeout for the changes. I think at this point, it would be appropriate to have a motion to accept the changes, and we can talk about it.
I move that we accept the changes and present status of the mission statement and vision statement.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. Is everybody happy with the changes, or do you think further changes are necessary? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. All those opposed? Rex, you're just a little slower. I'm not sure which side of the fence you were on. Okay, thank you. That brings us to the subcommittee reports. Both subcommittees have met now and began the work on the policies and action plans. Hallie, do you want to introduce that, and we can ask members who participated to share their comments about the first subcommittee meetings?
Sure. So subcommittees were split into two groups, one for the natural environment, recreation, and community, one for housing, economy, and transportation. Both groups met and used the first meeting, and for the economy, housing, transportation group, we'll use part of the second meeting to finish it up. But thinking about brainstorming for kind of policies and actions to implement the vision statement and then address some of the community concerns, community engagement that we've been hearing related to each of those topic areas. Did sticky note activities just to start kind of fostering ideas, thinking through those to provide us with some direction and detail for developing and building out a structure for policies and actions for the second and the third meetings.
Okay. So one of the committees was the environment, Parks and Recreation, and what was the other one?
Community.
Yes. So I'll ask members who participated in that first subcommittee your thoughts or comments on our first meeting. Incidentally, we planned up to 3 meetings for each of the 2 subcommittees, so we still have several to go.
I can offer a little bit anyway. I think we threw out a whole bunch of ideas. Maybe some were actions, maybe some were policies, maybe they were something else. And just looking forward to the next round where we can actually sort of hone in on producing those things from the various things that we did produce.
Anyone else from that committee?
Also add that it felt, at least to me, somewhat similar to the earlier group brainstorm that we did, that was in a slightly different context, but it felt like a lot of the same kinds of ideas came up.
Yeah. I might add that it's an important part of the work we're doing, because for each of the goals that we've established in our vision statement, we now want to establish a broad policy under each of the, could be several policies, it doesn't have to be one, under each of those. So for Parks and Recreation, you'd have a policy to continue to, let's say, maintain and expand recreational facilities. But the next important part under that is the action plan. So exactly what do we suggest in our plan that the community does over the next 10 years to reach and achieve the goals that are there? One of the parts I think that's interesting about that is they're much more specific. And so really make a clear statement of the kind of action future policymakers over the next 10 years and the administrative staff will take to implement the plan, which is important because it changes the plan from being something that we produce and winds up being on a shelf to something that actually gives some specific direction. The other part that we didn't really speak about, but if you take a look at the structure, it also identifies several things. A timeline, it indicates whether it looks like it would be easier or more difficult to accomplish, but much, and quite importantly, it identifies specifically who's responsible. So as we know, in most activities in life, particularly when I was raising my kids, if you don't tell them the specific chore that they're responsible for, they won't do it. So this is important to identify. If it's transportation, who's in charge of doing something about that? Probably maybe the public works or transportation planning, that kind of thing. So it helps identify for the administration going forward, who's the likely person that should be tracking this and looking at it? We haven't quite got to this, but importantly as well, be an evaluation program as well, so that it will set out what the expectations are for looking at these actions and to see how we're doing, how we're accomplishing it. So those things, I think, make the plan stand out from previous plans in providing a pathway and mechanism for which the plan can be useful in the future. So we'll go to the next group, which was housing, economy, and the transportation, I believe. Thoughts on that group? Dana?
Yeah, so I attended both subcommittee meetings. I would say that the housing and economy subcommittee came up with a lot to discuss, and I feel like that that discussion is going to take a while. I'm not sure that we can complete it in 2 more meetings, honestly, because there's just so much to talk about. But we had a lot of good ideas. I think that the one place that that I think is maybe a little problematic is I can even speak to, everybody had their own ideas, and we listed several. I listed several ideas, and I would probably say that some of them compete with each other, right? So as we decide on a direction, I think we could probably eliminate some and we could expand on others. But I think, we just need to have some pretty good conversation to keep going, get a little further.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and we put a lot on the table, so we got quite a bit to work with, and appreciate you were quite active in helping provide suggestions on things that needed to be accomplished. Other comments?
I think the way that the meeting was designed actually enabled some of the things that Dana was talking about. It was a little bit organic too, because it had a plan, and then we kind of, well, this sounds like a good thing to do, and thank you for adapting a little bit to what we wanted to discuss, I guess, and contribute to.
And if I understand correctly, staff, other than the planning staff, didn't participate as much at this point, but will be, and will be invited in, because part of what's important here is to get the perspective from those who ultimately will have some responsibility to follow up on this, and to provide some insight on what's happening, or is it planned to happen, and how is it achievable? The reality is we're going to come up with a lot of things and ideas, but there's only so many resources to accomplish everything. So if we want it to be achievable, it's going to be useful to get staff's input who has to work with this every day and to accomplish it. So we look forward to your input at a future meeting.
I thought the sticky notes were good. We kind of came in the same place with a lot of the comments people made. They could be batched fairly easily in a lot of cases. The thing I was struck by was the constant sort of conflict with state law or state government and municipal, decision-making, not only in housing, but also transportation. We expressed some frustration about roads that aren't really suitable for truck traffic, but MDOT regulations don't allow us to post them, things like that. And that's something we just have to continue to work on, and that's why we have a legislative policy committee that the mayor and other people attend.
Yeah, good comments. Anything further?
Yeah, just reflecting on Dana's comments. I think you're right, Dana, that there's going to be some good and need for, good debate, and looking forward to that. I believe that there's a fair number of staff who are planning to come next week, which is great, but I also am thinking we won't have everything completely ruled out, right? So I'm hoping that that's already built into the plan to have staff input when we're a little bit closer to final. So probably is, but I'm just pointing that out.
No other comments, so we'll move on to the,
Actually, to button this one up, maybe it would be helpful to have some notes on what the next couple of meetings look like, so we can prepare for those and come to those with some good discussion topics.
yes, I think that would be helpful. I'd encourage that as well. No other comments? We'll move on to the next item, which is future land use map. So you've had some material presented to you about future land use planning, and some conceptual maps. And at a little bit earlier date than you received the material, there was also some information on the draft land use map and categories, which were a little more interactive if you were able to take a look at it rather than the PDF you got in the materials. So Ally's going to begin to walk us through that, and we can start a discussion and comment in regards to the draft. And I emphasize it's very much of a draft that we'll still continue to work on.
Sorry, I'm trying to get everything between my few screens here put together. All right. So just to start, there was quite a bit of conversation at the last meeting about kind of the water and sewer area in relation to growth areas, and we just wanted to provide some information on where the state is at with implementing some of those density changes related to the work that we're doing here with the comprehensive plan. All of this graphics and information, we included a link in the story map to Southern Maine Planning and Development Corporation, which recently did a webinar on these trainings, has some infographics, and then also has the proposed rulemaking for all of these as well. If you're interested in seeing those or learning a little bit more, those are linked here and are available as well. But at a high level, the state is looking at growth areas kind of in three broad categories. So areas that are designated as growth areas, so as we've been talking about, those high growth, high density areas designated in the comprehensive plan that have water and sewer, areas with water and sewer that are not in those high growth areas, and then growth areas that do not have water and sewer. And the density requirements for those all look a little bit different. So if an area is a designated growth area with water and sewer, minimum lot sizes can be no larger than 5,000 square feet. So that's roughly 1/8 of an acre for the first 4 units. And then if municipalities will allow more than 4 units on a single lot, they cannot allow more than 5,000 square feet for each additional unit. So that could look like a couple of different options. The graphic on the screen, each color represents a different scenario. So if you have several, we'll call it 8 for the sake of ease here, 8 5,000 square foot lots, that could look like 32 units per acre, so 4 units per 5,000 square foot lot there. If a municipality is going to allow for more than 4 units on a single lot, they can't require more than 5,000 feet for each additional dwelling unit. So in the yellow and the green on the screen here, 4 units for that first 5,000 square feet or that first 1/8 of an acre. And then for each additional 5,000 feet on the lot, that would be 1 additional unit. So that could be up to 11 units on an acre if a municipality allows for that. In areas that have water and sewer but are not in a growth area, similar concept here, but you can allow 2 units per 5,000 square foot instead of 4. And so that looks a little bit different across all those scenarios. So that could be 16 units per acre if you have 8 5,000 square foot lots in an acre, or that could look like 9 units if you have kind of a 1 acre lot that has multiple units on it. And then in growth areas designated on the map that do not have water and sewer, those are regulated by the state septic requirements, which is typically 20,000 square feet per unit. I know, tried to make that as not technical as possible, and I hope that the visuals helped a little bit, but there was a lot of discussion around this at the last meeting. So as we're talking about those high growth areas, there is some nuance that can happen within a water and sewer area, so wanted to provide that information to the committee before we started diving into those growth principles in the draft map.
And I think the 20,000 square foot from the state guidelines is guideline, so you can have water and sewer on the lot, minimum size. Any questions about Bruce?
So I find this a little bit confusing, and I'm hoping you can clarify it for me. So if somebody purchases 5 acres of land in the growth area and they want to subdivide it, are you saying that for each 5,000 square feet, they have to have 4 units?
No, they don't have to have 4 units. That's just the, sorry, I'm trying to think of the right words here.
The city has to allow them at a minimum to have 4 units on that 5,000 square foot lot.
But they don't have to.
No, not right.
Good, you're confused. So is everyone else. If you're asking, like, we have to, it's not that, I'm going to look at all of us here. We have to allow the ability to have 4 units on the property. It's not that you have to put 4 units on the property, but the ability has to be there for a community to allow that.
Well, it says minimum lot sizes can be no larger than 5,000 square feet.
The city's ordinances on the implementation side in the zoning ordinance couldn't have a minimum lot size that's larger than 5,000 feet. So if you couldn't require a 10,000 square foot minimum lot size in these areas, if that is helpful. Sorry. Okay. I know this is new and technical, and so the proposed rulemaking was released, and this is based on that, but implementation of that will look different from city to city. But these are just kind of some broad considerations for kind of future density based on these area designations.
Adam?
I don't know if this will be helpful or more confusing, but on this stuff, I always like to think of it as the regulated party that we're talking about is the municipality and not the property owner.
I just figured that out. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam. Any other questions about that? Dana?
Yeah, so I think the one thing here that really kind of sticks out to me is that this legislation specifically targets growth areas, and that's kind of a new thing for the state of Maine, or maybe not new, but within the last couple of years, it's come up a couple of times. And I just wonder, well, first of all, how are other municipalities and cities, what are they doing to prepare for this? I understand that the rulemaking hasn't occurred yet, and so it's not necessarily time to actually change ordinances to revolve around it, but cities are planning for it, and so are they coming up with good ideas that we might want to implement ourselves? And also, as we're entering another legislative session, are there any other changes that are going to target growth zones that we might be able to forward thinking and plan as well?
So I guess I would start by saying I'm not sure that we would categorize everything they're doing as good ideas, but I think there's a lot of scrambling around to try to accommodate this. So this whole topic's MMA has a subcommittee that I'm on that's meeting with the Housing Economic Development House Chair about a lot of these issues. So I would say one of the predominant things that's going on is municipalities are moving to limit their growth zones. This is just my personal opinion, it's kind of a mixed bag. I think some of them, it's appropriate to do that, and some of them I think are trying to do this to get around some of the policies that the legislature is articulating. But one of the big problems we've come across is that folks will recall when the state planning office got in this business and they started doing comp plans, you were required to have a growth zone. Lots of communities that we've talked to in this submitted their comp plans and they were rejected because they didn't have a growth zone, because they don't have any place in their community that would look like what we would all think about as a growth zone. So what you find is very little of this piece in the middle of limited growth, and you see these big swaths of communities that are growth. And David can probably speak to this too, with some of the other communities with his peers. The struggle that they're having is a lot of the areas in their growth zone aren't appropriate, and they recognize that, and I think the legislative committee recognizes this. So they proceeded at the legislature with an understanding of the growth zone, which wasn't really aligned with what municipalities have been doing. So I think that's one of the things that you see. There's a lot of uncertainty about what your growth zone's going to be. I think that the House Chair has done a really good job trying to articulate that their vision and goal in this is for developed areas, right? They don't have to be as developed as downtown Auburn, but places where even in rural communities, their village center would be or whatnot, whether there's water and sewer or there isn't, to try to spur development in those areas. The other thing I would say is it's interesting because a lot of the larger cities, including Auburn, have places that are less restrictive than this already in their high-density areas, and you find, I think, a lot more support for these ideas and willingness to go this way because it fits in better with what they have in their community. So there's a list of pending bills. There's some restriction, and Adam can answer questions on this about the legislative process, but they're going in the second regular session. There's some restrictions, but there are some carryover bills that are being discussed, and the chairs were all allowed one sort of open omnibus bill that if they come up with particular things that they can put it in. So I think there's room around the margins. I don't think you're going to see any big changes. One of the things we hear from almost all the municipalities is between LD 2003, 1829, and some of the smaller bills, people need a chance to catch up because there's a lot of changes. Many of the towns, unfortunately, don't have the availability of staff and consultants with the knowledge, skills, and ability to do this work like we do. So there's a lot of catch-up going on.
Okay. Rick?
Just was looking at this, and thinking, well, this is quite a mandate. But then I just pulled up multifamily suburban, which has a density of 17 units per acre, which is actually more than what the state requires. The biggest thing is the 5,000 versus 10, which is what the multifamily suburban. So we'll have to tweak, but it may not be quite as onerous as the first glance would tell you it is. But it is sort of annoying from the standpoint of a city like Auburn, which has had progressive zoning, which has been, we have a wide swath of different ways to develop within the city. and most places in Maine don't. So we get swept in with people, that need to have some, mandates from the state, which make it sort of annoying to have to do the tweaks.
And so knowing about this as we do our work is what's helpful. So when you're thinking about growth areas, you want to keep in your mind what the state requires if it's a growth area, or in some cases, if they're just water and sewer there, even if it isn't a growth area. And so, as I see it, you look at those areas and say, does that fit now, or will it fit within the next 10 years? And if it raises questions, we should address it in the comprehensive plan now. Oh, Adam?
Just very, very much to Rick's point, one of the bills that got carried over is my bill. I think with a lot of this legislation that's been coming out, we've been very effective on the sticks, but not so much with the carrots. And so I have a bill that's intended to give communities like ours that are doing the right stuff when it comes to housing and density and growth areas to tie transportation funding specifically to those sorts of aspects that we're trying to encourage with other policy. And so I think now at the legislative level, that's the process we should be going through, is trying to tie those other things that are very meaningful when it comes to density and growth to the effective types of policy for density and growth in those areas. So that some of the communities, particularly those that don't have issues complying, they have effective water and sewer, but aren't complying because they just don't like the policy, to get them to have some skin in the game when it comes to investing in the right type of growth.
Yeah.
That's exactly the type of policy that I think I've been trying to encourage in the last subcommittee meeting is, instead of saying you can only do this, maybe it's we can do this and that if you do this. And I think, yeah, that's perfect. Let's keep doing that.
MDOT is the biggest obstruction to that, I would say.
As always.
Right here.
Oh, Phil.
Sorry. I threw my voice so you couldn't quite sure where it was coming. No, I think, Auburn's really positioned well to be at the table for a lot of these discussions. And I think it's important for the committee to know that. Not only do we have, a legislator that identifies the issues here and is putting together bills that are beneficial for us. The mayor serves on the Mayor's Coalition, actually directs the Mayor's Coalition, serves on LPC, is part of the subcommittee through MMA. I chair the Maine Service Center Coalition, part of the LPC, and Maine Municipal Association. And so we are, everywhere these conversations are happening, we're at the table. We also have representation at the Planning Legislative Policy Committee. They're speaking into these issues and trying to help direct. The challenge, and the mayor sees this on the LPC, is that the LPC is 70 members. Most of those members are tiny, small towns. And so the voice of the larger municipalities is really drowned out in that, unless we're at the table and we're having these conversations. So we get there through the Mayor's Coalition, through the Maine Service Center Coalition, through other areas that help make sure that we're at the table, we're having the conversation, and we're pushing these issues so that we're, in the best way possible, able to hold on to local control. And that's what we're faced with on every one of these policies, is just this overreach that the mayor talked about, these sweeping changes that we get pulled into. And so how do we continue to maintain local control? It's demonstrating that we have good ordinances in place, we have process, we have good growth zoning for growth, and we're advocating for that, and we're trying to demonstrate it at every level.
Good. Phil, thank you. It's good to know that we have very proactive leadership, both at your level and through the mayor, and keeping our voices heard, particularly for the service center communities. Any questions or comments? on that so far? If not, Ally, why don't we proceed to the next item?
Just quickly, there's one more change that might, just for consideration purposes, was a bill that now requires some level of residential development in commercial areas. What that looks like is still kind of to be determined, but in essence, residential units must be allowed in commercial areas. Municipalities can limit ground floor uses, so think of a downtown. Instead of converting those to residential, those can continue to be commercial with potentially residential above. And appears to be some flexibility in that, but that might impact, as the committee is thinking about land use categories, those commercial areas just a little bit more mixed use or allowing for residential instead of purely being commercial areas.
Yes, particularly in the downtown for sure, but in some other commercial areas in the city too.
So now looking at kind of the draft map. So the work that the committee did at the last meeting, we took those and applied those to a map. So principles for those high growth areas being areas served by water and sewer or planned water and sewer extension. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get there. Areas near existing rail, grids of streets, arterial roads that support movement and traffic flow connectivity, and then areas with industrial uses. The low growth areas being the existing ag zone, as well as the Lake Auburn water protection area. And then for those moderate growth zones, kind of filling in the areas that are left out of those two categories. As I talk through these, I will note that there's a couple of conflicts between some of these principles. So there are some areas in the ag zone that have water and sewer. There are some areas in the Lake Auburn watershed that also have some level of water and sewer as well. So after I finish running through this, I want to start there with just how does the committee want to address those conflicts. But on the map here, so you can just kind of see the process that this went through. So took the existing ag zone, as well as the Lake Auburn watershed protection area, and applied that to the map, just covered those together with green. You'll notice here, when we talk about these conflicts, there's a handful of areas as well that are in water and sewer areas, but we'll want to talk through kind of how the committee would like to address some of those conflicts. And then for the high growth areas here, applied the transportation, rail, airport, and sidewalk layers. The industrial areas existing today, and then the current kind of water sewer coverage area, and those overlaid together, if it loads, are in a red color. My apologies for this not loading. There's a lot of layers in these packages, so sometimes they take a minute to load. All right, while that loads, I'll still pull it up over here. So the full map looks something like this. Again, those green areas for the water and sewer, and the yellow being kind of the areas that are not included in either the high growth guiding principles or the low growth guiding principles. So some of these areas in the southern third of Auburn along some of these kind of roadways here, as well as some areas in and around the growth area, non-growth area, and then some corridor over here. There we go. So I think...
Would this be a good time to point out where those conflict areas are that you talked about?
Yes. So there's a handful of areas that are currently in the ag zone that have water and sewer. For the purposes of this map, we excluded these from the non-growth area, but just based on kind of our understanding of the discussion and the committee's priorities. So those are a little tricky to see. So this area over here, here, and then some of the areas kind of on the edge of the water and sewer areas as well.
What part of the community is that whoops, excuse me, that you're looking at? That by the lake, around the lake?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I will just turn on and off a couple of layers. So here's the ag zone, and then the water and sewer service layer. So some of those conflicts are over here. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but under. Central Maine Community College area.
Looks like at least part of that is the Graceland Cemetery, or is that the name of it? The cemetery right next to Lamy Wellahan.
So just to clarify, Ally, in this map that you have, you've defaulted areas that are in the Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay Protection District where there is water and sewer, and for our purposes, it's not physical water and sewer, it's where the pipes are to the terminal end, whether there's water or sewer there, and 200 feet from that, correct? In general?
In general, yes.
So I think for our purposes, as we look at these, if it's in the overlay district, it should be green, whether there's water or sewer there or not, because there's restrictive ordinances relative to development there, and there's an exemption in state law from LD 2003 and 1829 specifically to that overlay district.
Okay. Yep. So.
And that doesn't mean that, and that's just for the overlay district. You may have conflicts elsewhere where water and sewer goes through ag zone or something. We can talk about that separately.
So I guess to back up a little bit, we excluded the watershed overlay from this high growth area. So you can see this blue and the red matches up to the boundary of the Lake Auburn watershed. But for the ag zone, we included that in the draft growth area.
Yeah, so I think that's the right initial approach, and then I think we can identify these, because I think we're going to come up with two sets of things for the committee to talk about. We're going to be places where these initial principles overlap, and we're going to need to decide what we think about that. And then we're going to have places, I think, that are in a particular zone that when we look at this, we say, well, I'm not sure that makes sense, and perhaps it should be in one of the other zones. There's not an overlap, but just when we're thinking about future planning, it might not line up with what people envision for the future.
Right, so I think right now, that's exactly right, Jeff. We're looking at the conflict and how the committee wants to proceed with areas that are ag and water and sewer. So for our foundational principles, what is a priority for the committee based on, the vision of the comp plan? Do you keep the ag zone out of the growth area, or do you allow parcels in the ag zone that have water and sewer to be there? How do you want to reconcile that conflict right now?
So just looking through all of them, I can see there's like 4 of them, and a couple of them up by the mall are cemeteries. There's a piece of the gravel pit that is going to be conflicted. And then you've got the ball fields over where Auburn Suburban is currently. There's a piece next to the railroad, not the railroad, the airport that I guess we could look at. I'm not really sure. And then over in New Auburn, there's a piece that Delecto is currently farming. And so I feel like most of these are kind of toss-ups, and I don't think that there's like a strong need for them to be in the growth zone because they're not going to be developed, you know? So I think we're probably okay, but that one over by the airport, I guess I'm not really familiar with.
Yeah, not wanting to get into the merits of anything in particular, but just so I can understand it a little bit better, under the high growth zone map that you have that is red, in the parts of the zone that are designated high growth but that do not have water and sewer yet, but have planned water and sewer, if we designate that as a high growth area in this exercise here, I wonder what the implications are going forward. Is that an area where the city would lose control if that comes out that way in the comprehensive plan, or not?
The thing you're going to keep in mind is that unless there's water and sewer, then you don't have the density bonus that the state is recommending. So the thing that I keep throwing in around back and forth is, if we were to designate something as high growth that doesn't currently get served by water and sewer, how do you zone that? I mean, it doesn't really make sense to zone it something high density, but on the other hand, if you put water and sewer there, then you have to immediately follow up with a zone change to be able to develop anything. So I don't know which comes first, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, well, that's not our job, but
Sure.
But I just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think Dana has a very good point here, and I think what we need to think about is this is a chicken and the egg thing, right? If we leave it in some type of lower density, you're not going to drive people to examine it for development purposes. So I think at this initial phase, if it's water or sewer, or trying to put water and sewer there, we should put it in the high growth zone. We're going to have some variability as we move down into these land use categories, and then we can talk about, well, how do we handle that? Do we do it a different way? Because to Dana's point, right now, if you had it as a high growth zone, it's not water and sewer in that chart that Ally made, you're going to be at that middle piece where you don't get the full density, but you get more density than in a no growth zone, which, I don't know, we can think through that. That might be appropriate, but we don't want to cut off the messaging that that's an area we want developed.
So it has to be and, not planned.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think of it as sort of it's two-phase here. So if there's an area that, for example, that doesn't have water and sewer, but the plan is to extend water and sewer, in the planning document here, you could have it a high-density area. What that allows to do is that you don't have to change the comprehensive plan if you have a lower density. But in the future, when it's being zoned, it could be zoned, if it doesn't look like a while before it will be there, it could be zoned to something a little less than high density. As long as it's a growth zone, you can do that. So then you could later change the zoning much more easily. Then you're going to be able to change it if you have to go through a comp plan amendment as well. So I think that's sort of trying to balance the two of saying, how confident are we that we may need that within the foreseeable 10 years? And then the zoning can decide what ought to be there based on what's there currently, as long as it's not inconsistent with the direction of the comp plan. Jeff?
The other thing we might consider, I know we haven't got to this yet, but we're going to talk about the land use categories and sort of the characteristics of those and how they fit in these. So one of the things when we get to that regarding this problem we might think about is is one of the characteristics when you're in this high-growth, high-density zone, that if you develop there, you have to be connected to water or sewer, or maybe in some of these areas that are future planned, you don't, but under certain conditions, right? Because what we really want to try to drive in this high-density area to achieve the goals, you're going to need to be hooked up to water and sewer some way. So that might be something that we can talk about as a characteristic that we apply in the land use categories in this high-density zone.
Riley?
What you just said, Mr. Cleveland, about the having it available to be zoned to a higher density makes sense and might answer the question I had, but also having something designated as something that is planned water and sewer feels like we should have a definition for it, because on the planning board, some of these things haven't come before us for water and sewer, so I don't know what the definition of planned water and sewer is, because plans change. And so with the state regulations, sometimes somewhat putting us on the hook for a higher density, maybe it should be considered what is planned water and sewer, if it's a definition or just a hope.
Yeah, that should be clear, what it means to plan for it. It ought to be more than just an aspirational thing that you hope will happen. It ought to be planned in the sense that it is in a process of identifying it, looking for funding to be able to do it, to install it. Phil?
Ally, the way I understood one of your write-ups when you were talking about this, that there are some parcels that are swept up into this growth area that may have to Riley's point, may have no intention of water and sewer expansion.
Right.
But because it's surrounded, they're included in that.
Yeah.
So how do we identify that? What does that look like? Because I think that gets to that point of something comes before the planning board. There's no intention. It's never going to meet that definition.
Right.
So based on kind of the draft rulemaking through here, there's a third option, which is it's a growth area that does not have water and sewer. And based on the state's kind of rules, there's not requirements for properties near water to hook up to water. And then, but for the sewer piece, areas that are included in a growth area. So today that would be kind of this quadrant I have up on the screen here, that kind of Washington Street, Hackett Street, South Main, Vickery Street area here that doesn't have water and sewer would still be subject to the state septic requirements, which is roughly a half-acre minimum lot size there. But if it's in that growth area, the expectation would not be, unless it's within kind of that 200-foot estimated parameter, to hook up to sewer systems, that an area outside of that wouldn't be required to hook up to a sewer.
So just can you zoom out a little just to show the whole red area that you had before, Ally? So I guess here's my question. This red area, high growth area today, to follow up on Phil's question, are there parcels in there that are not within 200 feet of water and sewer?
Yes. At the meeting, the committee also mentioned.
Besides the planned area, Broad, South Main, Hackett Road, that.
There's a couple of industrial sites down in this area that are not within 200 feet of water and sewer, but are industrial. And then there's a handful of small gaps in here of properties that aren't hooked up to water and sewer, but are completely kind of surrounded by that coverage area.
What? You said planned again, the planned water and sewer. What are we going to define what the planned is?
Well, the only thing that we're actively pursuing today, to try to expand water and sewer in from a network expansion standpoint is South Main, Vickery, Broad, out to Hackett to Washington to connect into the pumping station out there. I think this is a really good point, though, that's been raised about in this zone. I think for our initial discussion purposes, those should be yellow. right? Because we said they're either these, ag or the overlay district and they're green, or they're within the 200 feet of the water and sewer and everything else is yellow, so we can see where they are. Because we may then say, no, we want to drive this in water and sewer in that area and make it high density, or we might just leave it this intermediary yellow step.
We can certainly update this full area to be yellow just based on our understanding of the conversation. The high growth area principles included water and sewer, planned water and sewer, industrial, and areas along kind of major arterials. So we included all of those regardless of whether it had water and sewer today or it didn't. But if it met those criteria in one way or another, included those in the growth area.
So say the criteria again are beyond, so there might have been more to this, but my recollection was what we were going to do is we were going to look at the physical location of current water and sewer, and on any street, they don't always end in the exact same spot. We were going to use the furthest terminus and then 200 feet from that. And then, so that may leave, as Phil's pointing out, holes in that area that would, for lack of a better, at this point, be yellow, other than that Vickery, South Main, Broad Street area where we're trying to pursue to push it into a high growth area.
We can update that. So there's a handful of kind of parcels in here that are not hooked up to kind of water and sewer today. And we have some information here on the state language as well, if anyone's interested, for kind of state requirements for hooking up to water and sewer. Per that statute, a building is deemed accessible to sewer if that building or any private sewer drain directly or indirectly connects to a wastewater system or at any point comes within 200 feet of that system. We don't have the capacity to do the GIS analysis for that, kind of based on those requirements right now. So there's a couple of areas of kind of indiscretion that we don't have kind of the tools right now to be able to answer, but there's some gaps in here that we could assume are within 200 feet of a sewer. So some of these smaller parcels that are completely surrounded here included those for kind of the implementation sake on the back end of this, not having kind of some parcel-based gaps within the growth area. But if there's kind of a preference for that, we can talk about that.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. Rather than just going to yellow, this is just my wacky brain, but we're talking about some spots that just don't happen to have water and sewer, and then we have the other area that would be helpful for me to have distinguished in orange or something else, like have that where there's conversation about some planned advancement. Just if that's okay with folks, it would just help me as I'm going back a few days from now or even a few hours.
So you're looking to have those areas a different color? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked that there's certain regions where there's active conversations about,
right,
where there's a plan, distinguishing that from areas where it may just be that currently they're surrounded by a growth zone that's defined by the first bullet in our guiding principles, and that is they have water and sewer. And those areas to me seem like a little different in terms of what we might want to decide or have a discussion around than we would for where there's a planning. It would help me to trigger that, okay, these are a little bit different than, or potentially a little different than what we're talking about. There's a big swath here that there's hope or there's thought, a desire that we would expand there. That's very different in my mind than some spots that are just don't have the water and sewer.
How do members feel about that? Do you think that would be helpful to do that, Adam?
I have a genuine question out of curiosity because I'm not I'm losing the thread. So I'm trying to figure out what the policy discussion or purpose is of changing it from red to yellow or orange or whatever other color.
Well, yeah, I think there's 2 points here. I think Tim's point isn't that we would necessarily take out of the discussion that this area that's on the map now, the broad Vickery, South Main area, whether it should be in high growth or not. He just wants a better way to visualize where the planned water sewer area is within this high growth zone. I think the other ones, the issue is that as we go through this, there's likely to be differences in the characteristics of how you would have these land use categories within these zones. And so if you're driving characteristics, assuming that you're going to, they have water or sewer today, or they're within easy reach of it, the 200 feet, the characteristics of what the committee might envision happening on that land might be different than the next step down. And to Phil's point, if there's places in there that don't have water and sewer, they're more than the 200 feet away, we should be treating them like the places that are outside that high growth zone. Unless we're going to look at these things, this is a first cut, and say, okay, well, maybe it looks like that, but we really think it should be high growth, and we're going to find places in the ag or high growth, we go, we need to adjust this. But I think the expectations around density and how much growth you want there changes among the 3 categories.
Yeah, Dana.
Ally, if you back up a little bit, this map actually does this quite well. So if you look at I almost want to call it purple, because there's like a blue layer of where water and sewer is connected, and then there's kind of a lighter red where it's not. That's a good way to look at it. So if you look at where the turnpike is, that line, just north of it you're looking at basically the old golf course in New Auburn, and that crosses across Vickery, and connects up to Washington, where is it blue there? It's blue there.
Well, maybe in that line, just a little bit more distinction between those 2 red colors would help the committee know we're thinking and planning, but this is an area that's clearly well beyond 200 feet of where the water and sewer line is, or would be even if you put it in. I'm somewhat familiar with that area, and if you go up Vickery and South Main Street, the whole interior area there that's way beyond 200 feet.
Just want to make sure I understand. Are you proposing only including the areas immediately along those roads where there's planned water and sewer?
Well, unless they plan to go, yeah. I mean, if the plan is to build them in this particular area where they're not currently there, but if you go beyond that and there isn't a current plan to go beyond that 200 feet, then it may be aspirational that somehow they get developed over time, but if you're not planning to build water and sewer, it's going to be difficult. Raleigh?
I guess that was my original point, was unless there's plans in place and funding, it's not planned, it is aspirational. There may be discussions and studies, but until do we have a definition for planned water and sewer? No, the city council hasn't voted to approve funding for water and sewer extension. It hasn't come before the planning board. So unless it might be something we'd like to do, but as far as, I know it's a 10-year plan, but as far as calling something planned water and sewer when we actually don't have any concrete plans, it seems.
Yeah, I understand the point, but the planning board process is way, way, way down the road from this, right? You got we have to go through all this process, and there's codes to be written. I think that the issue, though, is at a policy level, if in the comp plan we're not identifying this as an area of water or sewer, you're not going to get it. Nobody's going to go out and do the work and find the money and go through all these studies if the comp plan doesn't cover an area like this. So I get your point, but I think we'll work through that as we identify the growth areas, work down through the land use categories, and eventually after this whole process, there'll have to be a process to align the actual zoning districts where they're different with this, so you get to a point where it's clear to the planning board if site plan reviews come in front of them how they apply this.
It was in contrast with the state law, like the LD 2009, and the state laws that require higher density. That's why we wanted to be, like we said earlier, some cities are being more restrictive with their high growth zones. And so I think it's something we should balance those regulations with expanding, because as I'm familiar with the discussion, that area has been waiting on an exit off of the highway for 20 years as well, and that's never, seemingly the DOT is slow, and I don't know if that's, and that to get back to the chicken and egg thing, if we don't have sewer there, we're not going to build there, they're not going to give us an exit there.
Yeah,
but without the funding and actual plans for it, maybe requiring that land to have, or allowing that land to have a higher density requirement without the sewer and water for it in place seems like counting the egg before it hatches, I guess, to try to stay with the metaphor.
John? I think, and I apologize if I've made these things more complicated. I guess that's, my mind was going into the idea that there's a land use, and there's a big, just to your point, Riley, that there's a aspirational zone. And for me, it's helpful to just be able to see it. And like Dana said, these are slightly different colors. It's still in the high growth zone. And so, I just wanted to respond to your question, Ally, that I wasn't meaning to suggest that we change the definitions necessarily, but just to help me visually see where things are as we are then going to be looking at answering some of the questions that you have or looking at the different land uses. So that's just my own response. I don't know what others think.
Jeff, was that what you were saying earlier when you wanted that area to be limited growth, or were you agreeing with Tim that you wanted a different color? That area.
If you mean the piece just above the cursor there? Yeah, I don't think that would be in a limited growth area for the purposes of the discussion. I agreed with Tim that it's good to be able to visualize this, and we can see this here now with this, right? Like in the PDFs and stuff, you can't see that, but we do need a way to see where that is, because I think some of these issues that we're talking about will be solved when we go to the next step and talk about land use categories, because we can define characteristics for an area that's in the high growth zone but doesn't yet have water and sewer. It's anticipated, so there may be a different set of expectations around that area than there is in the red area that already has water or sewer, or you're within 200 feet where it seems like a reasonable expectation to connect.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think maybe another, while we're on this topic, food for thought for the committee is, do you want that area to be in a high growth, high density given the state legislation, or would you want to see it in a limited growth area, but it would potentially have water and sewer? Is another question you could ask. Do you see that area being high growth, high density if it has water and sewer, and if we put it in a growth zone, you're opening yourself up for that potential?
Right, so you are, but I think it was Dana that pointed this out earlier. You are, but you're at the next step lower because you're in a growth zone without water and sewer yet. So it's not the lowest thing on the three paragraphs that were in here. It drops you to the middle one until you get water and sewer there.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking. There's a medium growth, medium density area as well.
I was going to say, looking at this sort of like Center Street when I was a kid. Center Street was really developed from, I don't know, about where Dunkin' Donuts is down into the city. Auburn Motor Sales, Fordland, was downtown. It was where commercial development, 245 Center Street, Cumberland Farms, that area. And presumably, I don't know what kind of comp plan we had, if they even were required back then, but presumably Outer Center Street was a future growth area. So I would just put this in the same category. I think it's fine to have it as a growth area, knowing that unless somebody comes forward with deep pockets or we get a federal grant for water and sewer or something, it may not happen right away.
So the committee feels comfortable with the potential that within 10 years, that area could be a high-growth, high-density area and allow, high density, essentially. But we won't know if it will happen, but you're comfortable that it potentially could.
So does this address your issue of seeing it more clearly, Tim?
It does, John, yeah, thanks.
Okay. So, Adam.
Is there a way to use this tool in the fashion that it's presently being used, but also add like actual housing units to it so that you could visualize?
Like building footprint?
Yeah.
Do you want to see that?
Density is really the question that I have. Potential or current? Current.
Sorry, the cursor's throwing me off a little bit.
It's a big cursor.
I don't know.
That's why I'm asking you to do it rather than doing it.
Ally, isn't that in your land use map? Isn't that coming up in your next presentation?
Yeah, so it's just generally to show kind of existing density. Let me turn off some of these things. So that those black dots generally represent density.
Current density, not.
Yeah, I just wanted to look at it to sort of understand notions for the future.
So let's see if we're clear here. Tim, you're okay with the color differentiation, but we're going to give some additional consideration on exactly what the density might be, maybe through the characteristics that we describe it. So that if it doesn't have water and sewer, we're not planning to have water and sewer there right now, that we may describe it as a bit of a different area than a real high-density area where there's water and sewer available. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think so, John, and I think that one way to think about it is in terms of the, what was that little chart with the houses that was on there from LD 1829, right? That doesn't mean you can't allow more. So places closer to the core, the types of things, we'll have to come up with some type of a punch list of what we think these characteristics are, but, the typical things are like building height and what type of density you want to allow. So closer to the core to downtown, the density you might allow in a high-growth area with water and sewer, you might have lot sizes allowable less than 5,000 square feet. And you might allow, a lot more buildings than that, especially if they're building up. And the further out you go, even though you're in a high-growth zone, by the time you get out to the margins of that, you may be back down to what the state minimum requirement is. So the whole thing doesn't have to look the same, and we probably don't want it all to look the same. But so we can think about that as, I guess as you sort of apply sets of characteristics to different places within that zone.
Dana?
I'm trying to read through the URL and like get to the map with the layers that you're showing here. Is this available? It seems like I got most of the URL and I got to log in.
This is our internal GIS, so this is all of our resources.
I want to be able to look at it.
Put together a dashboard for the committee as well.
Lauren, I'm just I'm still processing your question a few minutes ago in terms of the committee, I think is in agreement that we like the growth zone as it is. But what were you asking, would we potentially want to take some of those areas that are kind of, to Riley's character description, aspirational, right? Not yet water and sewer, but planned, might be in the yellow? Is that what would not be in the growth zone? Or am I going down a road we shouldn't be going down?
I don't think you want to put it in yellow, because if in the way we've been proceeding, if it's in yellow or green, we're not expecting water or sewer there. Right? So I think that, look, on the margin of the red and where it goes into yellow, there might not be a lot of difference in the characteristics, but I think that where we have water and sewer, you want to keep it in your high growth zone, and then not, because the statement we're making, if we make it yellow or green, is there's not going to be water or sewer there.
Yeah, so aspirationally, I understand the need for this committee to decide on coloring. But I guess from a staff perspective, from like a state level, like, what are the repercussions of making something yellow? I mean, I think the way I read it, it seems like it's not regulated by the legislation that we've seen. But doesn't seem to be anything that says if it's not labeled a growth zone that you can't necessarily grow there. I mean, I think the idea of a transition zone is that it's probably not going to have a lot of growth, but we could certainly do some. So are there repercussions that I'm missing here? Are there things that we need to think about as a committee when we're defining some of these transition areas?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think that if we go back a few meetings, right, when in the 2010 comp plan, and this sort of context wasn't changed in the update, the labels that we used, even though they weren't the same as the states, they aligned with the state's 3 categories, and we had growth, limited growth, and no growth. But the reality of the situation is there's no place in Auburn that, I mean, there may be some parcels, like you can't build in a city park, right? But there's no areas in the city, even in the Lake Auburn Watershed Overlay District, which is the most restrictive zone, there's no outright prohibition. So I think that it's all a matter of degree of growth that we're looking for and what the limitations of those are. So I think thinking of it as a transition zone is another good way to think about it, which is those places will have more density, and we would expect more growth than in what we have as yellow than what we have as green, right? And I think that's what we're really trying to convey, is the allowable density and the amount of growth we want to see in those areas.
Has this helped clarify the thinking? I think it has. Okay.
I actually have a comment to Dana's point, that another consideration to having our high growth, high density area be where there is water and sewer, a consideration of the committee could be areas of the city where the current development type could change, given if it isn't a high growth, high density area, in a way that might not accommodate or be in line with what the committee would want in 10 years. So for example, or in the future, I'll say, I keep saying 10 years, but who knows. So for example, this area south of Taylor Pond is served by water and sewer. And it's in a high growth, high density given our principle. But with the committee, and I know we have our land use categories, do we want that to stay in a high growth, high density area, knowing that it could, we have to allow the ability to have high density in growth areas with water and sewer. So that could alter the development pattern of that neighborhood, of that area, potentially. So a repercussion, Dana, to your point of having something with water and sewer in a high growth area, which is why I was asking about that, Washington Street thing, is you're opening yourself up, not opening yourself up, but you have the ability to develop that to a high density area. So that could alter the neighborhood development density pattern, essentially. So not to push back against you, Jeff, but the committee should consider, like, yes, we had a foundational principle of water and sewer as a starting point, but do we want all areas that have water and sewer to be in this high growth, high density area? Because if it's in a limited growth, if it's not in a growth area, but it has water and sewer, the density allotments are lower than if it's in a high density, high growth water and sewer area, if that makes sense.
David?
The area that we've been talking about.
Yep.
This is another conflict point that we had.
So Taylor Pond, these are all 10,000 square foot lots, and it's all surface water and sewer. So if it's a growth area, and it's serviced by water and sewer, those minimum standards that Ally had out earlier, potentially could change the development pattern of this neighborhood, right? Whether that's going to happen, whether or not these people are going to put 40 units on their property, there's all kinds of factors around that, right, that could impact that. But that's the kind of conversations that staff's been having, is saying, should our growth area actually be small? Like, is this an appropriate spot to have that type of development occur? So we're going to yes. Can you go to Broad Street in Washington for a second? This maybe goes to Riley's point. We show this as a growth area out here, and this is the wish list that we're going to get a bunch of money. Put sewer on this road.
It's right here.
And maybe over there. I think that one's more of a dream. Anyway, it doesn't mean that all of this is going to see growth in here. I mean, you can still be in a growth area, but then you have to meet, if there's no sewer out there, it's 20,000 square feet. It's not this 5,000 square feet for growth and whatnot. It's still a growth area, but it's a different density that's being driven by the state statute. I'm reading the LD here. I'm trying to make sense of it myself. We talk about this probably every other day in the office as far as even how to apply today, never mind with the growth of the conflict. So I think when we talk about the growth area, we can be concerned about what that looks like. Is that going to really blow up the density? It doesn't have to, though, if there's no sewer. And at the same time, if there is sewer in its growth area, it really could change a lot. I mean, that's the total objective of that bill, is to get more density. And in my mind, that changes, some of the characteristics or nature of these neighborhoods.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, right? Because everybody that's familiar with that area recognizes that they put water and sewer there because the soil types are so bad that it wasn't really a good place for septic. So I think once we get this initial definition, and we're going to have to then go back and look at these places, because that's a perfect example of a place we might look at and say, okay, that shouldn't be red, right? That should be yellow. And we're probably going to see other places. There's been some brief discussions. I think John brought this up at an earlier meeting about the Exit 75 area, which isn't in red now, but we may say, hey, going down the road, this is an area that we want. So I think once we get this initial map, we're going to have to go through and look at these places in detail and I agree with Dana. It'd be very helpful if we could see these map layers so everybody could be, noodling around with this and thinking about things to come back to the committee and go, okay, here's a place I want to talk about because initially we have it in red, it shouldn't be. Or here's a place that isn't and it should be. So that we can fine tune the map.
That is what we're doing in this meeting currently, if we're ready.
Dennis?
Yeah, Jeff just said something that I've been noodling on, and I wanted to circle back to Mr. Beal's comment at the beginning of the meeting, which is the soil types. I think that comes in our next step, but the soil type can dictate what kind of development you want. I'm not sure how we take that into account, whether we get the soil maps out and start looking at that stuff or not, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, and another characteristic is topography in the area we've been talking about varies pretty steeply in that area. Great for cows, but if you want a house on a flat lot, that's not going to be the place for a lot of it. It's quite steep.
As I recall, there was a lot of ledge out there, so the sewer and water becomes even more cost prohibitive in that area.
Yeah, yeah, there is. You can see some of it sticking out of the ground. Becky?
Well, I think my point's been made, and it's really more of a comment, but I think, Jeff, you said it more specifically, that there will be an opportunity to maybe edit out or edit, which is always easier than writing.
Yeah.
But I also know, I just want to remind ourselves that we spent a lot of time on our vision and the kind of values and principles, and we probably want to do a test to make sure that all these decisions reflect them as well, and that, we not create a hodgepodge plan that people will say, what were they thinking? Because that, I don't want to be the headline in 10 years. What were they thinking?
What were they drinking? That's a good point, and it seems to me we're at the point here where we've identified some of the challenges that we're going to have to look at in particular areas, and I think the task that we have as a committee between now and the next committee meeting is to take a look at that. We do have another set that's not just a PDF that you can do some changes on, and you can blow up and zoom in or zoom out. I think it would be helpful if we each spent a little time doing that, so at the next meeting we could say, geez, I had some questions right here, it doesn't seem to fit in this particular area. And we can begin to work on those more systematically, piece by piece, following the overall principles that we've set. Vision statement. Yeah, Paul.
I do want to point out, and again, we're updating. This is a significant shrinking of the growth area that we have now, especially the south of the Turnpike, without getting into the granular stuff that we've already talked about. And we have had some attempts at zone changes out there that haven't been successful, just to give a little bit of the background on that stuff.
Yeah.
But that is it's the south of the Turnpike part that this would be cutting out of what's currently in the growth zone.
Yep, there may well be some differences between the two. So does that sound like it would be helpful? I think we've had some useful conversation and identified some areas that we need to think about in a little more granular way. And then at the next meeting, we can begin to take a look at some of those specifically and to see what our consensus might be in moving the boundaries somewhat if we think we need to do that in various spots. Allie, does that help get you to the next step?
Yes. If we had shared some work questions for the committee ahead of this meeting about some of those edits of kind of based on this draft boundary, kind of what thoughts do you have around changes to that? We can certainly provide a dashboard package that has all of this information in it for the committee to flip through. But as much as possible to make the most efficient use of our time at the next meeting, it would be helpful if we got some of that information ahead of time so we can highlight some areas of consensus and spend the time talking through areas where there's maybe not, so that we can be as productive as possible during that conversation.
Yeah, I agree that's a good suggestion. To the degree to which we can get those ahead of time, we can be a little more prepared to deal with it in a systematic way. Adam?
In what form would that be most useful to you?
If you want to circle things on a map in a PDF, that's fine. If you want to write out comments, that's totally fine. Whatever kind of iterates the point that you're trying to get across, we can make use of kind of any format that's appropriate.
You can come meet with me in my office.
Is there a particular date that you would want before and no after and not after?
A deadline for
a deadline?
AKA a deadline?
So the next meeting is on the 16th. We typically have the information together a week ahead of time, so that would be the 9th. If it would be possible by the 4th of December or the 5th if needed, we can compile that information into something to be able to share in the committee's packet for all of you to be able to look at as well. We have a dashboard package put together. We just have to add in the draft growth areas so we can turn those around pretty quickly and work with city staff on an appropriate way to share that with the committee.
Thank you.
Yeah, Bruce, go ahead.
We're supposed to meet on Monday on this land use. We won't be covering the things that you're asking us to cover now.
No, that would be the subcommittee to talk about the economy, housing, and transportation. So a little bit separate from this.
Yeah, the land use map is going to be worked on by the committee as a whole. Okay, you have your assignment.
I would also ask that we pointed out a couple of conflicts in the story map version of this, so areas that are ag today, water, sewer. As you're thinking through these changes, consider some of those conflicts between some of those guiding principles as well, so that we can work through an approach to mitigate some of those. I think the committee largely agreed keeping the Lake Auburn watershed area in green. That's in green today. That was a potential conflict, but some of those ag zone areas, some planned water, sewer extension, those types of things as you go through this.
Other items under the land use map portion of our agenda?
There were other conflicts. I think those areas that I discussed south of Taylor Pond, but I feel that the committee might need more time to dig into those in order to come to a conclusion about those areas. More food for thought for me, because I love that. Should the growth area be continuous entire the whole thing, or should it be, nodes of growth and so on? So think about those as it relates to the development patterns and so on. But I think for right now, our conversation about the future land use map will be better suited once the committee has more time to look over the materials.
Okay. And in your packet, there were some suggested questions, as Ally alluded to. They may help guide some of your thinking as you're looking at the map. Looks like we have about 20 minutes before 8. Do we have enough time to have just an initial introduction to the land use categories, descriptions?
So just based on some of the conversations that have been happening already, the committee's already started talking about some of these things, whether it's in this meeting or in subcommittee meetings. And we just wanted to provide a very, very conceptual, very high level, very preliminary kind of framework for what this could potentially look like. Knowing that there's going to be some more discussion around kind of what growth looks like in different areas, what growth might look like in some of those limited areas or those low growth areas as well. So these are kind of intentionally vague, but highlight some of the places that exist in Auburn today for consideration. And then as we're talking about kind of what these areas look like in the future, some potential kind of language for the level of detail that typically is included in these types of plans. So we provided a high-level table here that outlines a handful of potential land use categories, and then just based on what we provided, if there were significant proposed changes. A lot of these are similar to the context that exists in more developed areas today, but proposed some changes through a mixed-use area where there's kind of existing commercial corridors and things like that. So things for the committee to consider for the next meeting are kind of what are the types of places that exist in Auburn today, and what would the future of those places be. So there might be a lot of neighborhoods that are of a similar size and a similar scale, more urban neighborhoods in and around the downtown area, more kind of moderate density areas kind of surrounding that. What might the future of those look like? So we, just for the story map, the circles are just to put kind of a general geographic area of what these types of places might look like. So they're not specifically chosen for a neighborhood, but they're based on kind of the scale, the density, and design being similar between some places within Auburn. So for the downtown area, highlighted some of those existing conditions, a potential vision for the future, so a mix of uses supported by local small businesses, increasing social activity, expanded transportation options, trails and paths, access to a mix of housing types, services, retail, and entertainment businesses. And then broadly, the types of land uses that exist. Again, the zoning conversation and zoning ordinance updates to kind of implement these visions will happen afterwards. So this won't get into specifics like what should the minimum lot size in these areas be, or a use table kind of coming out of these, but very broadly, kind of what is the vision for these areas, and then zoning would be the tool for that implementation. So again, I know the yellow might be hard to see on the screen here, but just chose based on kind of current density, a handful of high density neighborhoods that exist today. We included some photos for reference to kind of illustrate what we're talking about with the size and the scale here. Some local commercial, some recent infill apartment style development, single family, 2-family, 3-family homes on small lot sizes. And again, kind of that future condition and land uses there. And similar for some of these more moderate density areas or considerations for moderate density areas. These might be existing neighborhoods, potential areas for transition between urban and rural areas. And again, these are kind of broad categories, and the circles illustrate kind of a spectrum of what that looks like in Auburn today. And as we have these discussions with the committee, want to work to refine kind of what scale and density for the future is appropriate for some of these areas. Mixed-use corridors, you know, based on recent changes and some of the conversations with the committee already, as well as the Washington Street study that's ongoing, identified a handful of corridors that might be appropriate for more mixed-use style development. So kind of existing conditions with some of that kind of strip style commercial development. What might that look like in the future? So included some renderings and links to Washington Street study, and then a development company that's done quite a few kind of mall area redevelopment projects as well. So if the committee's interested in those, again, these are kind of concepts of potential changes or ways to reimagine or re-envision areas that are appropriate for that kind of reimagining or redevelopment. And then again, identifying areas that, like historic neighborhoods or the downtown, that should kind of retain and remain in existing form, encourage infill development, those types of things. Again, for industrial areas, is there a desire from the committee to support some more employer-owned housing options that might expand some of the uses that are in some of these areas? And then again, a broader conversation around what the ag zone, low density residential kind of areas look like. I think there's been some discussion around what that looks like, but we provided a very, very broad kind of spectrum of what that is and largely what it is today, but would implore the committee to kind of discuss what development looks like in those low growth, kind of non-growth, that green area on the map as well. So again, these are broad visions for broad areas within the city. It's not quite to the level of detail of a zoning map, but again, pictures that kind of ideal vision or ideal future that the committee and the city envisions for different areas and different parts of Auburn.
Questions, clarifications on any of that? Boys, Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. A couple comments. So it seems to me that in these growth areas, they're all going to have one or more land use characteristic applied to some area within that, probably more than one, probably several in some of them. And that's really, those characteristics are really a bridge between the designated growth areas and a subsequent activity of zoning. So as we develop these, right, what we're saying, and hey, these would be the guardrails around what zoning would fit in there. So as we think through that, it would be helpful to have a checklist of characteristics, right? So we have a bunch of different ones here, like draft categories, which are fine to start with. But it would be helpful if we just said, here are the characteristics we need to identify when we develop one of these. Whatever, I'm not sure I know what they are, but instead of trying to come up with one of these summaries, it's kind of hard to follow for each one. If we said, hey, here's the 1, 5, 6, 10 questions, that the things we would fill in the blank to say, this describes a characteristic of this particular zone. We got to answer these questions for each one.
We can certainly provide that. That's typically things like what types of housing are there, what types of businesses are there, what does kind of mobility and transportation look like, open space, parks, recreation, and then kind of those quantitative look and feel, kind of place-making type questions as well. So we can certainly update the questions that were in the packet to include some of those more kind of characteristics or defining areas.
Other questions, clarifications? Allie, I'm going to provide you a document I don't believe you have, which is relative to the agricultural resource protection. That area, not that long ago, was had some changes made to it in regards to uses within that area. And I'll send that to you because your description doesn't quite catch it all. So I'll send what those changes were. Becky?
I think this question I was going to hold for the committee, and I don't want to talk about it now with 4 minutes to go, but just in general, it came up at the committee meeting regarding kinds of housing we're not seeing in our area.
Yeah.
And wondering if there's any kind of overlay or policy issues that prevent certain kinds of things happening, and making sure we are aware of those before we would decide on this. I don't have an example, but we brought it up at the committee that
Yes.
we're not seeing certain kinds of development here in Auburn, and is there a reason for that?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Becky. That particularly relates, for example, and we saw it in our housing study, that senior, places for seniors who want downsize from their big house, which is 50% of the houses in Auburn right now, by the way, and would like to go to a place that's the right size for them, 1 or 2 people. By doing that, and then, have the appropriate kind of services so they're not mowing the lawn and all of that, open up those houses for either younger people or reuse for smaller units. And we don't see a lot of that right now in Auburn. Allie?
I would say for the purposes of the comp plan, I think these visions and these policies can outline kind of what types of housing that might not be there that would like to see in the future, and then those zoning changes on the back end would be what updates those to make those feasible and make those possible if there's barriers to those as well. So I think I'd encourage the committee to think about kind of what types of housing might be needed that aren't existing today, or types of homes that kind of would like to continue seeing or building and encouraging that type of development. And then the back end of that would be kind of that evaluation of the ordinances that either restrict or encourage different types of development.
Oh, Dana?
Yeah, I'd just throw out to the committee, check out missingmiddlehousing.com. And they go through a lot of all these different types of housing that happen in between like an apartment building and a detached single family. And it's really it's a great book that goes along with this website, but they give you a primer on some of these things. The other thing, going back to missingmiddlehousing.com, it's an awesome book too. I would kind of bring up too so some of these land use categories, I want to be careful about down zoning or down shifting a neighborhood to allow for a lesser amount of development than it currently allows. The one thing that plans like this can really screw up a neighborhood if you make a bunch of housing non-conforming, through zoning because of the plan. And so I think that's something that this committee should be sensitive to, that we have the ability to really handicap homeowners by saying, this should be a smaller density than what it currently is, and then it leads to a zoning change down the road. Those types of things produce real consequences for people.
Any other comments or clarifications? We're about 7 minutes from 8 o'clock. Thank you for your time this evening. Thank you for your good thoughts and participation. Staff, consultants, thank you for your good work as well. If there are no other business, I would accept a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor to adjourn? Unanimous.